The transfer confirmation email arrived at 6:47 on a Tuesday morning, and I was standing in the hospital parking garage in my coat when I read it. 3 years, 14 researchers, 112 peer-reviewed citations in the preliminary bibliography alone. The National Institute of Health had approved our grant application in the amount of $483,600 over 4 years, and the email was 2 sentences long, and I stood in that parking garage for 4 full minutes before I walked inside. I did not call anyone. I did not cry. I forwarded it to my department coordinator Yusuf with a single line that said, "Start the paperwork," and then I clipped my badge to my lapel and went to work. My name is Delia Ashworth, and I am 44 years old, and the morning that email arrived was the same week my father walked into a restaurant on Collinwood Road and told his friends I had never amounted to anything. He did not know I was in the room. I should start earlier than that. Most things require that. My father, Gerald Ashworth, is 68 years old and retired from a mid-level management position at a regional supply company he joined at 23 and left at 65. He was not a cruel man in the dramatic sense. He never raised his hand. He was not loud. What he was, I came to understand much later in my life, was quietly and persistently diminishing, the kind of man who did not know how to be in the same room with someone else's success without finding a way to reduce it. His own father had done it to him. Gerald's father had been a foreman at a manufacturing plant in Dayton, Ohio, and by every account I ever heard from my Aunt Pauline, my father's older sister, who called me every Christmas without fail for 30 years, Gerald had grown up watching his father dismiss every ambition he named. Gerald had wanted to study architecture. His father had called it impractical. He enrolled in a business administration program at a community college instead and spent the next 40 years managing supply chains and telling himself that was what he had chosen. I think about that sometimes. I think about the version of my father who stood in a kitchen in Dayton at 17 years old and felt the first piece of something go quiet inside him. I think I understand it. I do not think it excuses 40 years of doing it back. What Gerald did, once he had children, was simple. He kept a hierarchy. My older brother Dennis was capable, ambitious, and followed Gerald into management work, which meant he was explicable and therefore safe. I was the second child, and from roughly the age of 12, I was consistently described to relatives, neighbors, and eventually Gerald's rotating cast of retired man friends as the one who was still figuring things out. The one who tried a few things. The one who hadn't quite landed yet. I was 12 when he said it first. I was 39 when I stopped correcting him. The early biography is not complicated. I enrolled in nursing school at 22 after 2 years of general study, genuinely loved it, completed 3 years of the program, and then deferred my 4th year when my mother had a knee replacement and needed recovery support for 4 months. Gerald did not suggest I defer. My mother did not ask me to. I made the choice because it seemed like the practical one, and because I had always been the practical one, and when I returned the following year to finish, I had already been accepted into a joint nursing and medical research track at a university hospital 40 minutes north. I completed both. It took 6 years instead of the standard 4. I finished with a clinical nursing license, a master's in health services research, and a doctoral candidacy that I completed on the other side of a full-time hospital position and 2 cross-country moves. Gerald's summary of this arc, delivered at Thanksgiving dinners and neighborhood barbecues from roughly 2004 onward, was, Delia started nursing school, and it wasn't really for her. I corrected him 11 times across 15 years. I eventually stopped because correcting him had no effect except to make me look, in the room, like the defensive one. My mother, Linda, was gentler and also less present in these conversations than she could have been. She loved me. I do not doubt that. She was also, by temperament, a person who smoothed things over rather than named them, and smoothing things over in our house meant agreeing with Gerald's version of events in the room and then calling me privately afterward to say she was proud of me. I understood the shape of that arrangement by the time I was 30. It didn't hurt less. I moved to Harwick, a mid-sized city 2 states away, 8 years ago to take a position as a clinical research coordinator at Dunmore University Medical Center. Over the following years, I moved up, senior coordinator, program lead, and eventually 3 years ago, department director for the Center for Population Health Research. 14 staff. 7 ongoing studies. A patient advocacy committee I built from scratch and was quietly proud of. I did not announce these promotions to my family, not because I was hiding them, because I had learned, the way you learn things slowly, that announcing them produced a specific kind of response from Gerald that I did not have the energy to manage. A brief silence, then a pivot, then a question about Dennis, or a long story about a colleague Gerald admired, or a slow repositioning of the conversation's weight so that it landed somewhere other than on me. I kept my professional life in Harwick and my family life in the form of bi-monthly calls and holidays. I showed up. I was present. I did not discuss my work unless asked, and I was asked rarely. The Earl Grey tea tin with a dent on the lid sat on my kitchen counter every morning at 5:45 when I got up, and I made my tea, and I went over my notes for whatever the day had scheduled, and I lived the life I had built in a city where no one's version of me was 40 years out of date. Yusuf Rahman, my department coordinator, had worked with me for 4 years and was the kind of colleague who remembered the names of your houseplants and stayed late without being asked. He was 31, meticulous, and deeply funny in the dry way of someone who processed everything through observation rather than reaction. He knew the broad outlines of my family situation because I had told him, once on a long drive back from a conference, the way you tell someone things when you're tired and the conversation has nowhere formal to go. He never brought it up again unless I did. I appreciated that more than I told him. I am telling you all of this because the Friday evening in question was not a dramatic setup. It was not engineered. It was the coincidence that coincidences actually are improbable and therefore always eventually inevitable, and I want you to understand that I did not plan it. What happened because of who I had already become, not because of any move I made. The Friday was the 14th of February. Not a holiday I tracked particularly, but the kind of date that fills restaurants. Yusuf had suggested we take the team to dinner to celebrate the grant approval. The formal email had come through the previous Tuesday, the $483,600 confirmation I had read in the parking garage, and the team deserved the acknowledgement. I had booked a table at a restaurant on Collinwood Road called Harwick Grill. 12 seats, good food, the kind of room with amber lighting and dark wood walls that felt appropriate for something that had taken 3 years to build. My father and his retired friends had a standing Friday dinner. I did not know they had started going to Harwick Grill. Gerald had begun spending weekends in Harwick because his friend Raymond's daughter lived here, and they had apparently discovered this restaurant sometime in the fall. I found all of this out later from my Aunt Pauline, who found out from my mother, who found out from Gerald after the fact. At the time, I only knew that I arrived at the restaurant at 6:15 to check the table, 20 minutes before my team, and that my father was already there. He was seated near the bar with 3 men I recognized as his Friday group. Raymond, a man named Pete, and a fourth I didn't know. They had drinks. Gerald had his back to the door and didn't see me come in. I saw him immediately. I stood near the host stand for a moment. I thought about asking to be reseated. The restaurant wasn't large enough for that to mean anything. I want to be honest about the next few minutes because I think about them. I left my coat with the host and walked to the bar to let them know I had arrived, and I passed within 10 feet of my father's table. Raymond saw me first and said something to Gerald, and Gerald turned, and his face did the thing it does when he registers surprise and arranges it into pleasantness. He introduced me to Raymond and Pete and the fourth man, whose name was Carl, as his daughter. That was it. Just his daughter. The way you might say this is the waiting room, or this is the exit. Carl asked what I did. Gerald said before I could answer, "She's in medicine." Sort of. It's complicated. She started nursing school. It wasn't really for her. She ended up in administration. He smiled at me the way you smile to signal that you're being kind. She's still figuring it out. He turned back to Raymond. I said it was nice to meet them, and went to my table. I sat down. I put my hands flat on the table. The ambient noise of the restaurant was in the middle range, other tables a low music track, the sound of the kitchen, and I looked at the bread basket the server had placed at my setting, and I thought about nothing in particular for a long moment. Raymond said something that made the group laugh. I did not look over. I thought, I am 44 years old, and my father just told a stranger I am still figuring it out. I thought, this has been his story for 22 years, and I have never once been able to get a word in edgewise in his version. I thought about the grant. I thought about Yusuf and the 11 other people who were going to walk through that door in 15 minutes who had given real portions of their professional lives to the work our department was doing. I thought about the preliminary mortality data from our second study, which suggested our intervention model was reducing late-stage diagnosis rates in underserved zip codes by a number that was going to matter when it published. And then I stopped thinking about any of it and just sat there with the bread basket and waited for my team. I have to tell you about the 20 minutes before I walked into the restaurant because they belong in this story. I sat in my car in the parking lot of Harwick Grill from 5:52 to 6:11. I had arrived early because I always arrive early, and I had intended to go straight in. Instead, I sat in the driver's seat with the engine off and the heat still running, and I did not move. I had my phone in my hand. I had pulled up Aunt Pauline's contact, Pauline Edenhart, 69 years old, the only person in my family's orbit who had ever said plainly and without softening that what Gerald did was not fair. She had said it to me once on the phone when I was 36 and had just been passed over for a recognition that went to someone whose father knew the committee chair. She had said, "Your father learned to do this, Delia. That doesn't make it yours to carry." I almost called her. I sat with my thumb over her name for a while. What I was feeling was not anger exactly. It was something older and more exhausting, the specific fatigue of having spent your whole adult life being accurate about who you are to a person who has decided who you are and will not be moved. The fatigue of knowing that no credential, no title, no peer-reviewed publication had ever landed anywhere near Gerald's version of the story, and that none of them ever would, because the story was not about me. The story was about what Gerald needed to be true. I sat there, and I thought, you could call Pauline. You could sit in this car and be sad about it. You could go inside and do your job. The heat clicked off at 6:08. The parking lot was dark except for the restaurant's windows, orange and warm, and I could see shapes moving inside. I thought about the study data. I thought about a patient from the previous winter who had written a letter to the department, a handwritten letter, 3 pages on lined paper, thanking us for the early screening that had found what her regular doctor had missed. I clipped my badge to my coat pocket out of habit, even though I was off the clock, and I went inside. Some feelings do not need resolution before you can keep moving. Sometimes you just fold them up carefully and put them in your coat pocket and walk through the door. Yusuf arrived first, at 6:29, in his good coat, carrying the small framed certificate from the department's second-year review that I had framed and forgotten about, and he apparently had not. He set it on the table like it belonged there, which I suppose it did, and said, "I thought it should come to dinner." "You carried that on the bus," I said. "It is a modest certificate," he said. "It fit in my bag." The rest of the team arrived in the next 10 minutes. 12 people at a table that seated 12. Marceline, who had been coordinating patient recruitment for 2 years and had a laugh you could hear from the lobby. Dr. Sandra Kowalski, our biostatistician who had stayed late 47 Tuesdays in a row the year we were rebuilding the analysis framework. Therese, the youngest researcher on the team, 26 years old, and already the most rigorous mind in the room on methodology. 8 others who had done the same work, the same long hours, the same careful painstaking building of something real. I gave a short toast. I said what I meant. I said the work we had done together was the kind that stayed, not in grant paperwork but in the numbers that would come out the other side of it, in the zip codes that would look different in 10 years because of what we had measured and named and proved. I said I was glad to be in that room with those people. Gerald's table was visible from where I sat if I looked over my left shoulder. I did not look over my left shoulder. Yusuf gave his own toast, which involved 3 mispronounced Latin phrases he had clearly looked up that afternoon, and the table was warm and loud and entirely itself, and for an hour and 15 minutes I was exactly where I should have been. Dr. Renata Okafor arrived at 8:04 p.m. She was not meeting us. She was there with her husband, a quiet man named Thomas who taught secondary school, and her sister-in-law, visiting from out of town. They were seated 2 tables away, and the host brought them past our table, and Renata stopped. She stopped because she saw me, and because Renata Okafor is the kind of person who, when she sees you, sees you. She had been director of clinical research programs at Dunmore University Medical Center for 11 years. She had recruited me 8 years ago. She had, over the years since, become the kind of colleague you could call at 10 p.m. about a methodology question, and who would call you back. She was not my supervisor anymore. I ran my own department, reported to the Executive Research Committee, but she was the person who had looked at my application in 2017 and seen something worth betting on. She stopped at our table and said, "Is this the celebration dinner? Yusuf emailed me about the grant approval." "It is," I said. "Good," she said. "You should be celebrating." She looked at the table, all 12 faces, all the people who had done the work. "The board approved your research grant this morning," she said to me, and she said it the way someone says a thing they know matters. "The formal announcement goes out Monday, but I wanted you to hear it tonight." She shook hands with 3 people at the table. She said she was proud of what the department had built. She moved on to her own table. The room did not fall silent. That is not what happened. My team was talking and laughing and had not processed the administrative weight of what Renata had said, because to them it was confirmation of something they already knew, not a revelation. But Gerald's table was 7 feet away, and Gerald had heard every word. I know this because Raymond leaned over to Gerald and said something, and Gerald looked at me, and it was not the pleasantness-arranged face. It was something I did not have a name for, and did not go looking for one. It was Gerald's face at 8:04 p.m. on a Friday in February, looking at his daughter the way you look at a document that says something different from what you expected it to say. I did not look back. I turned to Marceline, who was asking me something about the Patient Advocacy Committee's next quarterly meeting, and I answered her, and I stayed at my table until my team said their goodnights and went home. I did not walk over to Gerald's table. I did not explain myself. I did not give him the scene he probably expected me to want. He had seen enough. Gerald called me the next morning at 8:21. I was at the kitchen counter with my Earl Grey tea and my laptop, going over notes, and his name came up on my phone, and I looked at it for 3 rings. I answered. He said, "I didn't know that was your boss." I said, "She's not my boss. I run my own department. She's a colleague." He said, "I didn't know you were a director." I said, "I know." There was a silence. Not short. Long enough that I watched steam rise from my mug twice. He said, "You never told me." I said, "I told you I was promoted 3 years ago. You asked me what Dennis was up to." Another silence. "Delia," he said. And then he stopped. I waited. I had learned by 44 that Gerald's silences usually ended in a pivot. He would find somewhere to put the discomfort that was not himself. He would ask about something else, or say he had to go, or make a joke that repositioned things. He said, "I didn't know you had a research grant." $483,000, I said. Over 4 years. We're studying late-stage diagnosis rates in underserved communities. He said, "That's good." I said, "It is." He said, "I didn't mean what I said to Carl. I was just explaining." I said, "I know you were." There was another silence, and in it I heard something I had not heard from my father before. Not apology, exactly, and not the pivot. Just a man sitting with something uncomfortable and not immediately escaping it. I did not know what to do with that, and I am still not sure I do. I have thought about it many times since. Aunt Pauline called me that afternoon. My mother had already called Gerald, which meant the story had traveled through the family in under 12 hours.
Pauline said, "Well,
It sounds like the universe handled it." "Dr. Okafor handled it," I said. "Accidentally. The best things usually are accidents," Pauline said. "How's the study going?" I told her. She listened the way she always listened, actually with questions, the way you listen when you are interested in the person and not just managing the call. We talked for 40 minutes. She asked about Yusuf and about Marceline and about the patient who had sent the 3-page letter. I told her about the mortality data. She said, "Delia, you built something." I said, "We did." "You built something," she said again, firmly in the way Pauline says things she wants to be sure you actually hear. There is a thing that happens when someone you love says a true thing to you plainly. No decoration. No caveat. Just the fact of it, delivered like they want it to land. I sat with my phone after we hung up, and the navy wool coat with the missing third button was on the hook by the door, and the tea tin was on the counter, and I was in my kitchen in Harwick in the life I had built, and I thought, yes. My father called me one more time, 3 weeks later. It was a Sunday. He did not pivot. He asked, for the first time in my memory with actual interest, about the study, what we were measuring, who the patients were, what we hoped the data would show. I told him. All of it. I was on the phone for an hour and 20 minutes. He asked 2 questions that were genuinely good questions. I answered them. It was not a transformation. I want to be careful about what I say it was. Gerald is 68 years old, and the pattern he carries is old and deep and not mine to undo. He did not apologize, not in words. I do not know if the conversation he had with himself that night in the restaurant, and I believe he had one, because Gerald is not an unthinking man, only a man with a blind spot the size of his own history. I do not know if that conversation changed anything permanent. What I know is that he called. He asked. He stayed on the phone. That is not nothing. I have decided to let it be what it is. I thought about his father in Dayton. I thought about a 17-year-old who wanted to draw buildings and was told not to be impractical. I thought about how a wound that is never named can travel down a family line for 50 years before someone finally puts their hand up and says, "This stops here. I am not carrying it." I had lunch with Yusuf the following Wednesday. He brought the small framed certificate back to the office and hung it on the wall near the door, and I let him, and every morning when I come in and clip my badge to my coat, I see it there. The study is running. The data is growing. Therese published her first solo methodology paper in March, and I wrote her a reference letter that was 5 paragraphs long, and every word of it true. My mother called me last month, and we talked for an hour about nothing important, her garden, a neighbor's dog, a documentary she had watched twice, and at the end she said she was proud of me, the way she always says it, quietly at the end of calls. I said thank you. I meant it. Pauline sent me lavender soap at Christmas. She has done it every year, for as long as I can remember. Some kindnesses are the kind that do not announce themselves. They just show up, year after year, without requiring you to notice out loud. I want to say something to you before I go, because I think it might matter. There is a particular kind of erasure that happens so slowly and so quietly that by the time you name it, you've been living inside it for decades. It does not shout. It does not leave marks you can point to. It just tells a story about you in room after room, and because it comes from someone you love, you spend years trying to correct it instead of simply building something the story can't reach. Love that demands you remain small is not love. It is the management of someone else's fear. A family that cannot celebrate you has not been robbed of that capacity. They have simply decided that your success is threatening to the arrangement they understand. That is their work to do, not yours. The cost of spending your life defending your resume to the people who should already know your worth is your whole actual life.
You do not get those hours back.
Forgiveness is not access. Understanding your father's wound is not the same as opening the door every time he knocks. I understand Gerald better than I ever have, and I love him, and I am not going to keep being small in his presence, so he can feel comfortable. Choosing to be fully who you are, even in the rooms where you were once taught to take up less space, is not arrogance. It is the most ordinary kind of courage there is. What I know now, at 44, is this: the work you do in the hours no one is watching, the study that gets filed, the grant that gets approved, the letter that gets written to the department by a patient on 3 pages of lined paper, that is the record. Not the version of you that someone else carries in a story that is 22 years out of date. Your own account of yourself is the one that matters. Write it carefully. If someone in your life has been carrying a version of you that doesn't fit anymore, that was never accurate to begin with, ask yourself how long you've been trying to correct it and what you might build instead with that same energy. What would you do with all those hours?